So, hello and welcome to NAMB's presentation on the introduction to the new standards for cultural safety. Just before we get started, just some housekeeping things. Many of you may be familiar with the Zoom meeting platform. However, we thought we should point out a few features just to assist you with your experience with today's presentation. We'll respect everyone's time by maintaining approximately 15 minutes for the presentation and equivalent time for any questions after the fact. Just ask that everyone keep their questions to after the presentation. Should there be any more questions beyond the 30-minute mark, we would ask that you ensure they're written in the chat feature so that way we can respond to you following the meeting. The chat feature, the dialog box icon, can be found at the bottom center toolbar of your screen. We will be recording this presentation, just the presentation portion of the meeting, and that will be shared for those who are unable to join us today. You may wish to adjust your screen view in order to see the presentation, presenter view, or full participants, which is gallery view. These different views can be found in the top right-hand corner of your screen. And everyone's currently muted, which prevents background disruptions for us. We'd ask that you remain muted unless you're asking a question during the Q&A period. The mute feature is located beside the video button for your camera in the bottom left corner of the screen. And finally, during the Q&A period, we ask that you raise your hand, which is under the React feature found in the bottom center toolbar of your screen. This will place you in queue. You can also write your questions in the chat feature, as that will be monitored by my colleague, Sylvecki Todd. Okay. So we'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. NAMB acknowledges that our office is located on the traditional territory of the Wolastoqey, and that all NAMB interactions take place on unsurrendered and unceded lands of the Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy, as outlined in the Treaties of Peace and Friendship. NAMB also would like to thank the visual artist, Amber Solomon, a Wolastoqey artist from Village First Nation, for her work on the graphic design in the Standards for Cultural Safety, and you'll also see it throughout this presentation. Today we'll begin with why cultural safety matters from a regulatory standpoint as a necessary approach to delivering safe, competent, and ethical nursing care. Then we'll review the development process for these standards. We'll move on to defining what cultural safety is and the goals of the new standards. Next, we'll go through the structure of the new standards as well as the new expectations for nurses. I'll finish the presentation by providing links to the resources to support the implementation of these standards into our nursing practice. So why cultural safety? NAMB identified cultural safety as a key nursing process and outcome in order to achieve more equitable and safe healthcare. Cultural safety is directly related to NAMB's mandate for public protection, given that cultural safety aims to achieve psychologically, physically, mentally safe care for all. Recognizing that other nursing jurisdictions across the country have developed standards for cultural safety, it was determined that NAMB should develop standards for cultural safety to establish the minimum expectation for practice across New Brunswick. It's important to recognize that safe healthcare experiences are not guaranteed for everyone. In fact, over 1 in 4 Canadians report experiencing discrimination in healthcare based on race, religion, language, health condition, gender identity, sexual orientation, and other personal characteristics. This kind of discrimination and racism leads to deep mistrust in the healthcare system and can cause individuals to avoid seeking care altogether, which increases health disparities. The drivers of discrimination are not only individual types of racism, but are often systemic, embedded in policies, institutional norms, and cultural values that privilege certain groups while marginalizing others. These systemic issues go beyond individual actions. Even well-meaning care providers can unknowingly uphold dominant cultural norms or reinforce power imbalances in the provider-client relationship. The new standards for cultural safety directly respond to this. They do more than set expectations for respectful behavior. They ask nurses to recognize and address the structures that create unsafe care, such as racism, discriminatory policies, and lack of accountability. So these standards were developed using a collaborative approach and gathering feedback from multiple external collaborators and experts. In 2023, a survey was sent out to nurses and the public to gather external feedback on what should be considered in a standard for cultural safety. Furthermore, a group of external consultants with expertise in cultural safety was formed. This group worked together to develop broad standards for cultural safety that apply to all nurse-client relationships in all practice settings. Early in 2024, Indigenous consultation was identified as a gap in our standards at that time. As this work progressed, it became increasingly clear that more representation and voices were needed to shape the standards for cultural safety, specifically in relation to Indigenous principles and indicators, above and beyond the general principles and indicators for all nurse-client relationships. A workshop was planned and completed on July 17th, 2024, with an elder Indigenous nurses from various First Nations across the province, as well as urban Indigenous nurses. After the workshop, it was recommended that a literature review be developed and disseminated to the Indigenous nurses for feedback on Indigenous-specific principles and indicators. This literature review and suggestions for the standards were developed in September 2024 and went out for feedback in October and November. I was the lead on the project, so I received the feedback with individual nurses throughout October and November, so throughout that fall of last year. External consultation for the entire document was completed with external collaborating partners, other nursing jurisdictions across Canada, and the original group of external consultants in February and March of 2025. So cultural safety, when we're defining it, cultural safety is both a process and an outcome rooted in respectful engagement. It's not just about what we do, but how we do it, with awareness, humility, and genuine respect for the people we care for. The goal is to create an environment that is free from racism and discrimination, one where individuals feel safe, valued, and heard throughout their healthcare experience. Cultural safety also means recognizing and addressing power imbalances that are deeply embedded in healthcare systems. It brings attention to the influence of colonization, systemic oppression, and dominant cultural norms, and challenge us to shift those structures to make care more equitable. But it is important to understand that culturally safe care provision is defined by the client, not the healthcare provider. That means no matter how well-intentioned we are, it's the client's perceptions that determines whether the care they receive is culturally safe. As nurses, we're expected to provide culturally safe care. That requires us to acknowledge our position of power and to allow the person receiving care to lead in defining what safe means for them. The standards for cultural safety set the expected level of performance for all nurses across all roles and settings to provide safe, competent, compassionate, and ethical care that responds to the diverse needs of the populations we serve. Part 1 of the standards of cultural safety outlines 5 core principles that apply to all nurse-client relationships. These principles are broad and inclusive, addressing not only ethnicity, but also religion, language, health condition, age, ability, gender identity, and sexual orientation. They promote a reflective process, starting with self-awareness and expanding to relational, organizational, and societal levels, encouraging nurses to consider their own position in the care they provide. The 5 principles in part 1 are: number 1, self-awareness; 2, relational awareness; 3, client-led relationships; 4, trauma and violence-informed care; and 5, safe healthcare experiences. Part 2 builds upon these and introduces 2 additional principles that are specific to nurse-client relationships with Indigenous peoples. This section affirms the constitutional, treaty, and human rights of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, drawing on frameworks like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act and the TRC calls to action. The additional principles in Part 2 are, so number 6, Journey of Learning, and 7, Respect for Indigenous Identity and Knowledge. Together, these 7 principles provide a foundation for culturally safe, equitable, and respectful care for all clients, with specific guidance for working with Indigenous populations. So for Part 1, the standard outlines 5 core principles that we just discussed. So number 1 is self-awareness. Nurses understand that cultural safety begins with self-awareness and critical self-reflection. They commit to examining their own reality, values, attitudes, beliefs, biases, and assumptions, recognizing how this influences their practice and interactions with clients, families, and communities. There's 6 associated indicators within this principle. The second is relational awareness. So nurses recognize that while cultural safety is client-defined outcome, they play a key role in creating the conditions for culturally safe care. Nurses cultivate self-awareness, sensitivity, and humility before the onset of the nurse-client relationship and contribute to inclusive, respectful, and culturally safe practice environments. Nurses utilize an intersectional approach to recognize how overlapping factors such as race, gender, class, and ability shape clients' experiences and access to care. There are 8 associated indicators within the second principle. The third is client-led relationships. Nurses foster a nurse-client relationship that strives for culturally safe care and is underpinned by an understanding of the client's experiences, needs, and expectations, and mutual trust and respect. There's 7 associated indicators within the third principle. The fourth is trauma and violence-informed care. Nurses recognize that trauma, whether interpersonal, historical, intergenerational, or systemic, has lasting impacts on health, well-being, and trust in healthcare systems. Nurses incorporate approaches informed by trauma and violence-informed care into nurse-client relationships. They create conditions for healing by promoting physical, emotional, cultural, and spiritual safety, supporting client choice and autonomy, and building trusting relationships grounded in empathy, transparency, and collaboration. There are 5 associated indicators within Principle 4. And then the 5th is safe healthcare experiences. Nurses contribute to safe healthcare experiences beyond the individual client encounter. Through their actions, influence, and professional responsibilities, nurses work to identify and address the root causes of unsafe care, such as systemic racism, discrimination, or exclusionary policies. Nurses promote inclusion and equity, including advocating for organizational and structural change that enhances culturally safe systems. There are 8 associated indicators associated with this principle. Part 2 of the standard, as I previously mentioned, builds upon the 5 foundational principles of cultural safety that are applicable to all nurse-client relationships and practice settings. It's specifically applicable to nurse-client relationships involving Indigenous clients. 2 additional principles have been developed to address the unique histories, rights, and healthcare experiences of Indigenous people. When providing care to Indigenous clients, all 7 principles, so the original 5 plus these 2 Indigenous specific ones, are intended to be applied in all practice settings and relationships, including with Indigenous clients' families and support networks. They were developed to address the unique histories, rights, healthcare experiences. And as previously mentioned, they're rooted in documents like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, the Truth and Reconciliations Commission of Canada Calls to Action, and collaboration with local Indigenous nurses. The principles are, so the 6th one, Journey of Learning. Nurses build knowledge through ongoing education and a commitment to lifelong learning to understand the connection between the historical and ongoing treatment of Indigenous people and current health outcomes. There are 6 associated indicators with this principle. And number 7 is respect for Indigenous identity and knowledge. Nurses demonstrate respect for Indigenous identity within nurse-client relationships when clients self-identify. Nurses offer the choice to incorporate values and traditions into nurse-client interactions and advocate for and support initiatives that honor and preserve traditional Indigenous health practices at organizational and system levels. There's 7 associated indicators with this principle. So the expectation for nurses are clearly outlined for nursing practice, and they reflect core areas of responsibility. These include proactive self-reflection. So nurses must continually examine their own values, beliefs, biases, recognizing how their positionality influences care. Lifelong learning. Nurses are committed to ongoing education, particularly around colonialism, cultural humility, and anti-racist practices. Nurse-client relationships. Nurses build trust-based relationships rooted in respect, collaboration, and client-defined safety. Clients are the ultimate authority in determining whether care feels safe and inclusive. Addressing power imbalances. Nurses are expected to recognize and respond to power dynamics in nurse-client relationships and healthcare systems. Systemic advocacy. Nurses should advocate to change systemic racism and exclusionary policies that impact access to safe care. Trauma and violence-informed care integration. Nurses must provide care that promotes emotional, cultural, and physical safety, avoiding re-traumatization. And commitment to reconciliation. Nurses must honor Indigenous rights, respect identity and traditional knowledge, and support Indigenous-led solutions in healthcare. We recognize that some of the concepts and terminology related to cultural safety may be new or unfamiliar for a lot of nurses in the province. This is a complex and evolving area of practice that requires ongoing reflection and learning. To support nurses in understanding and applying these standards, we've created a cultural safety toolkit, which offers practical resources, a reflection guide, and learning support. You can access the toolkit on the NAMB website to help deepen your knowledge and build confidence in providing culturally safe care. For any other questions or comments, other than the Q&A that is coming up, you can always email us at practiceconsultation@namb.nb.ca. So I will